Put a little joy in your heart, and the world will be a better place, and the world will be a better place for you and me. Just work and see. Put
So
a
let me just start
little.
out by thanking you for joining us for one thing, and second, to point out that the end purpose of this particular discussion is to have a significant impact on education on a global scale. We're seeing the pandemic interfering with education in dramatic ways in all countries of the world, US included. And we're really, the discussion and observations that we make during the course of this um, hour are aimed ultimately at taking some action that will help to solve that problem. So we're solving for education in this discussion. Um, I guess that you already went to the next slide, but I will point out that only half of the world's population is online. And so we have a double whammy here. One of them is the COVID problem, and the other one is the fact that the infrastructure isn't there for people to get access to the internet for purposes of improving education. So we have two big problems to deal with. So let's keep going, Maylin, to this. Yes, thank you. Here we are. So now this is the other deficit. It's not just access to the internet that's the problem, but in order to make useful access to the internet, you have to have a computer or a laptop or a desktop or a tablet or something. And we don't have those readily available at home. And in the case of the pandemic, going to the library may not be an option either because the libraries have been closed because of the possibility of further spread of the virus. So this again is another gap, that we have to deal with. Let's go to the next slide. The reason that we're having this call is that we all think, at least certainly Maylin and I think, we should do something about this. And so that's the purpose of this call, is to suggest things we could do. Next slide. Oh, this is a wonderful thing. Buckminster Fuller never changed things by fighting existing reality. You have to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. It also makes me think of Albert Einstein. You can't dig yourself out of the hole using the same thinking that got you into the hole in the first place. So this is the call for innovation, if nothing else. Next slide. I think Maylin would like to jump in on this because she's thought very hard about this whole question of how do we organize ourselves and what do we focus on in order to make a difference, especially in the context of the UN efforts for sustainable development. So Maylin, I think this is your slide to speak to.
Thank you, Vint. And I will turn it back to you to talk about practice-based decision-making, but let's talk about these 4 boxes here. The UN Development Program, the UNDP, has already got SDG accelerator labs in 60 countries. How can we actually have the SDG accelerator labs harness our collective intelligence to actually put research into action to achieve the UN SDGs? One of the reasons it's important is, for example, the European Union Horizon Europe has committed to achieving the UN SDGs. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is to do action research in community. We can't do this research in ivory towers. We have to test and localize policy and regulation. As we go into this digital frontier, we're pushing up against constraints due to regulation and policy. The ITU has already begun to have reg for COVID. It's a hashtag REG for number 4, COVID. And they're pushing to actually see how can regulations help make internet more accessible. But to do this, we have to have tech professionals, people from the IEEE, from the ACM, who are part of the professional organizations of the world that are technology oriented, working with local communities so that, in fact, we can do regional sandboxes to improve digital policies and regulations, not least of which have to do with keeping children safe. The infrastructure for local communities to thrive. The United States has really been able to spread the internet because it thinks about it as a continent level pipelines, what's required for people to connect. Yes, we haven't connected everyone in North America, but it is far more connected than a place like Africa. There are efficiencies in economies to think at the continental level, but current development programs are all at the national level. And finally, how can we all work together in action research for the UN Sustainable Development Goals? One of the biggest things that has happened in all our lives is the spread of the internet. And the internet came about because of practice-based decision-making, and Vint is best placed to explain this.
So let's, I think we can go to the next slide, assuming that's the IETF slide. Here we go. So for those of you who might not know, the evolution of the internet starts with the Defense Department trying to figure out whether packet switching is a useful tool. It builds the ARPANET, discovers it works, then goes on to say, what if we had different kinds of networks, radio-based nets, satellite-based nets, how do we hook them all together? That's the internet problem. I eventually ended up in the Defense Department at ARPA running the program, and very quickly concluded that we needed to have a group of people who could not only do the work, but also somehow have a feedback loop so that what we learned would become codified and eventually standardized. And groups got created in order to achieve that objective. One was called the Internet Configuration Control Board. Another, that morphed into something called the Internet Activities Board, and that morphed into the Internet Architecture Board. And in the process of all that morphing, it spawned something called the Internet Engineering Task Force, which today is where all the standards for the Internet are developed. And one of the mechanisms for this is to test the ideas by implementing them, and also making sure that whatever documentation has been produced allows independent parties to produce software which will actually interwork after they finish the implementation. So the basic sequence of events in the IETF practice is that somebody identifies a missing piece or a capability that doesn't exist, or an improvement that could be made. When there's consensus on attacking that problem, a working group gets set up. They produce a collection of proposals that get written down first as draft documents, internet drafts, and they get continually iterated, and finally they are proposed as requests for comments, which are the standards documents of the internet. And it's often required in order to progress from a proposed standard to either a final standard, that there be at least 2 implementations or more that have been built and shown to interwork. And so the practice in the IETF is to build things, test them, find out what works, find out what doesn't, iterate, document, and adopt. And finally, that standardization is made available to everyone for free. So I think.
Excuse me, sorry, yes, okay.
That's okay, that's fine. That's sort of where we are. And we'd like to see whether that paradigm can be applied to the problem we're trying to solve, which is to make education work better, make communities work better. So Maylin, back to you.
So I want to bring up the social aspect of the spread of the internet. The internet spread from university to university, and individuals within each university set up the network information centers. I want to bring up one individual who did that in Kenya at the University of Nairobi. Ndemo Bitange was one of the graduate students who set that up. He eventually had a career that made him the permanent secretary of ICT in Kenya. And he helped open the doors for M-Pesa. If you ever wondered why mobile money started in Africa, It's because a graduate student was pulled into working and setting up a network information center. This kind of exposure to world changes at an early age can make a huge difference for young people. And that's what we want to do in schools, that how we set up the internet in schools allows the children and the high school students to have that same kind of excitement and sense of agency that Ndemo Bitange had, which allowed him to help open the doors to mobile money in Kenya. The networked improvement community is the second wave of the Network Information Center, and it was always behind Douglas Engelbart's ideas that helped to spread the internet. When he thought about how the internet spread, he always felt it needed to be community by community, because individuals could end up being seduced by greed or power, whereas communities have been what humans have used to balance out our individual agendas and work on things that help us survive as a species and as a community. So the idea of network improvement communities and how we go to schools is really the natural progression of how the internet originally spread. Progress requires participation. I grew up in Singapore, and I was part of where Singapore had to find its own way, and nobody expected that little brown people far away in Asia from here could actually pull things off. But what I saw was that when everybody around me was working together and had a big dream about how to survive as a country, we were all able to participate in what is now one of the economic miracles of the world, the progress of Singapore to a flourishing city-state. That included trust, security, inclusion, and fairness. And we must make sure that everybody can participate. And as we go to schools, the safety and security of our children has to be one of the biggest priorities. No longer is your teenage daughter safe sitting in your living room, because if they're connected to the internet, things could happen. How we connect the schools needs to include the guardrails that protect our children. We have to include the excluded. Growing up in Singapore, I also read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and it resonated. We can't have techno-colonialism as the next wave of colonialism. We know the problems and we must avoid it. So we must have active participation of the people who are left out. And we've seen that in the pandemic, when people, the forgotten, the people in the nursing homes, so on, people who are forgotten, they can end up being terrible cracks in our society, exposed for the whole world to see. Let's not do that as we go and connect the schools. And finally, for a flourishing planet and flourishing people, so many of us are involved in moving forward the UN Sustainable Development Goals. How can we do this where all can participate? And I think the internet model of anyone, anywhere, it can be part of a positive, virtuous cycle where we have an open review of the different ideas, a sort of open source for sustainable development. We can then make sure that people can say, well, you didn't think of this. And so we have digital guardrails. And this is where the technology community can be involved in all different aspects of how can we have a flourishing planet and flourishing people. Back to you, Vint.
I keep remembering to unmute. Let me just briefly go back to the slide that said NREN. You don't need to go to the slide. I just want to make a couple of
Let
points.
me go back. It's all right.
Well, so it turns out that the National Science Foundation was the means by which the National Research and Education Network program in the US got started. There were a number of other similar kinds of initiatives in other parts of the world. One of the organizations that has worked very hard on facilitating NREN growth is the the Network Startup Resource Center at the University of Oregon, which today is run by a guy named Steve Hooter, who has worked very closely with the people-centered internet. But his philosophy is very much like Doug Engelbart's. You show up and you work with the community. In this case, it's typically the educational community, most likely the university, possibly in the capital city, to bring them into contact with the research and education networks of the rest of the world. But it's this participatory arrangement where you don't leave until you're sure they can run their own piece of the internet, they can grow it, and they can extend connectivity to it. So we're starting to see some of the university networks connect to the K through 12 schools in order to draw them into the NRAN and into access to the information that's available. So it's a very self-generating kind of environment where once you get going, it has the potential to continue to grow in a very biological way. Okay, so let's go back to the progression of slides where we were. One thing that is super important is to recognize that just getting connectivity to the internet is the first step. And it's in some ways a minor step, because if you're connected and you have a computer, it doesn't do you any good unless there's actual content that's useful that you can learn from. And moreover, if you have a disability, then there are barriers for useful access to that information. And it's a pity that the one community that should be able to make the most adaptable technology in the world accessible has not done a great job of achieving that objective. So one of the things that we can highlight as we try to solve the problem of improving education is to go after improved accessibility for the applications that are on the network. Otherwise, as this slide suggests and as the Secretary General suggests, those people will be too easily left behind, even if others are able to take advantage of their connectivity to the network. So we should take Secretary Guterres' words to heart.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Go to the next slide. It's fine. Remember, we're trying to allow for time for discussion, and it's already getting close to 1 o'clock.
Yes. Okay. So imagine how we actually make the jobs of technologists and scientists to inspire the next generations. The wonder of our innovation and research can inspire children and advance global citizenship and draw young people into technology and science. And we all want to achieve the UN SDGs, so let's do it together, involving the science and technology professions in this great quest. It can bring so much more meaning to our work. And I want to credit George Smiley of the Netherlands for this quote. And how do we start? We start with schools, with bringing people like you together who care that the next generation should have the opportunities you have had. Hundreds of generations have allowed us to be here listening to this presentation. I want to challenge you to think, are you going to be willing to be the weak link in the chain of the hundreds of generations of people? So you need to be involved with this. We can take advantage of what's already underway with the UNDP Accelerator Labs. There's the Africa Moonshot program, which the Alliance for the Affordable Internet helped to write and is rolled out by the Global Broadband Commission, chaired by President Kagame of Rwanda and Carlos Slim of Mexico. This moonshot was announced in 2018. So let's make sure that it does the job right now, that's right in front of us. And in the end, we have to pivot to lifelong learning and earning. We should build back better. We shouldn't go back to those big empty classrooms. How can we do this? Engelbart was the second node of the internet, and he, with SRI and UCLA, began the whole spread of the internet with that first beginning message. He taught me what to do about involving communities, and it's about local participation for global outcomes, but in a steady and consistent cadence. Just like corporates, reporting has happened quarterly, monthly, annually. We have iterative cycles of improvement, and we should do this on the UN SDGs. But now with technology, we can do longitudinal tracking, we can do real-time dashboards. Reality is the ultimate test, and we are not testing the efficacy of how we spend our money. And finally, feedback is key for creating lasting change. Feedback from everyone, not just the convenient ones.
So could we go back to that slide for just 1 second? I don't know about the rest of you, but I looked at the slide the first time and I thought, holy crap, that looks like Arrival. If any of you remember seeing the science fiction film with the First Contact. I'm sure that wasn't intended, but actually it does tell you that language is really powerful and important. And so as we approach this problem and as you try to engage in it, think about what your words might mean, because in fact, they can be very influential. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so sources of likely players. Already through our monthly meetings, we have engaged with individuals from many of these groups. And we want to say that there is interest and we are working out how to do this. And we take your input because we're going to co-create the next wave of the internet to solve the current problem of the 1.3 billion children, but actually to bring back the ideas from the original genesis of the internet about how it allowed people to connect.
Go
ahead. Yep, please.
I just want to mention something about this. The thing that made the internet so successful, in my opinion, is that its architecture was extremely flexible. And so it allowed people to work in any area that they were interested in. They could either do an implementation of an existing set of protocols, they could decide that the functionality wasn't adequate, they could invent a new protocol in some horizontal layer, or they could add a new layer, as happened with the World Wide Web and HTTP. This flexibility was important, but the other thing that was important is an individual effort or a particular small group effort could contribute to the whole because there was a framework in which they could do that contribution. And so I think it's very important as we think about this particular problem of getting education into the hands of kids who need it, that it's a big and complex problem with lots of different dimensions to it. We need to make sure that however we go about doing this, that small groups and individuals have the ability to contribute in a constructive way, so we don't end up having to do some kind of a top-down, very structured and very controlled effort. What we want is one which is rich in bottom-up capacity and innovation. So that needs to inform our thinking about how we actually go about executing on this idea.
I want to say you heard it from Vint Cerf. And if you think about how miraculous the spread of the internet was, it was because of good-hearted people like himself who said, hey, let's do this. Let's actually work out how to do something that's incredible. And that attitude brought many players together. So we talked in the previous slide about the non-private sector, the public sector, but where does the private sector play? Once we begin this process, just like in the internet, the private sector can come in. But this time we're going to make sure, especially for the schools, that it doesn't end up being a profit-driven endeavor. Profit is important, but public good is important too. And we as humans have to preserve the best in our societies to pass on to the next generation.
With regard, let's go back to that slide.
I'm trying to just keep talking. I will get there.
So when you mention profit making, before you decide to say, well, profit making is a bad thing, and I'm to suggest you said that, one of the things that made the internet successful was, in fact, it was possible for some people to actually make a living out of some aspect of the internet, whether it was writing software or producing routers or producing networks or offering service or putting together applications. It's very important for sustainability that there be an economic element to this. And it doesn't have to be a private sector profit-making thing, but all the costs ultimately have to be paid for somehow. So there has to be a business model for the various pieces to survive. That will allow them to. In some cases, it could be a continuing contribution by governments. In other cases, it might be charitable organizations that maintain the momentum. But there does have to be some kind of a business model that works. And so one of those is, in fact, a profit-making business model. It just can't be the only motivation for engagement. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody sees a broad picture of different kinds of ways of dealing with the cost of making this all happen.
I want to thank Matt Gamser from the IFC, International Finance Corp, the private sector arm of the World Bank, for insisting that we should have a slide like this when we've last presented. Now we're into how do we make this a learning loop, because Rome wasn't built in a day. And the next wave of the internet, the way we want it to happen, has to include both the haves and have-nots. Vint, I would like you to talk about the Mobius strip.
Okay, so this, you look at this thing, and first of all, it's a symbol of infinity. But it also is a kind of Mobius strip. If you've ever done the Mobius strip, it's so cool. You get a bunch of kids, and you give them a strip of paper. And you point out that the paper has two sides, right? You can flip it back and forth. And if you want to write on both sides, you have to flip the Mobius strip over. And then you say, let's turn this two-sided, two-dimensional thing into a one-sided, two-dimensional thing. And so you give them a piece of tape, and they twist a half twist of the paper, and then they glue the ends together. And you get something that looks like this. And if you stick your pencil down on the paper and you pull the strip, eventually you will have covered both sides of the strip because of the fact that it has only one side, not two. And the only way it is possible to do that is to have rotated it half twist in a third dimension, which is not the dimension of the strip. And this is, for all practical purposes, a wonderful illustration of out-of-the-box thinking. Get out of your two-dimensional world and get into the three-dimensional world. And it is transformative. And so some of this symbol is very important from that point of view. It's a representation of transformative thinking. And if you actually read the text that's in here, you get the point about how much transformation is possible. So Maylin, I'll let you take over from there.
So on the right-hand side, we could have the network of local experiments. But then the feedback from those local experiments can be looked at a meta level to plan how to decide what to interoperate, what to standardize, so that more of the breakthroughs locally can spread more quickly. This was part of Engelbart's idea of networked improvement communities, that if one community does the breakthrough, there should be a group that helps move the breakthrough to all other communities, but also allow for local adaptation. He called it writing the handbook. You write a handbook about how you did the breakthrough, and then you spread that handbook. So we are now at the end of the presentation. If you just say a few words, I'll take it to the final call to action.
Okay, well, I want to point out one thing that I hope you might have noticed about the theme that's buried in this presentation. And that theme has to do with the ability to meld independent activities together in a way that's mutually reinforcing. Now, what you want is, again, something that allows a bottom-up character to be productive. I'll give you an example of two technologies which turned out to be mutually reinforcing when they came together, even though they were developed for a period of probably on the order of 20 years, 25 years independently. And that's mobile phones. Mobile telephony was started in 1973 by Motorola and Marty Cooper. And that same year, Bob Kahn and I were starting to write the specs for the internet. Those two things went in parallel. In 1983, the internet was turned on and the first handheld mobile was demonstrated by Marty Cooper. Then those two technologies continued to go along independently of each other until 2007, when the iPhone shows up from Apple and Steve Jobs' incredible vision of what happens if you marry a computer and a camera and a microphone and a speaker and a keyboard. What can you get out of that? And the answer is something pretty spectacular. The two technologies came together in a mutually reinforcing way. The mobile made the internet accessible from wherever you were and could get a mobile signal. And the internet made the mobile a lot more useful because of all the content of the internet and the applications that were reachable from the mobile phone. And so these are examples of independent things working together to create more than the sum of the parts. And I think what Guterres is trying to say here is that we have an opportunity now to take some decisions and to do so in a way that allows these independent efforts to weave together to have a huge impact in the future on the children of the next generations that really will have their responsibility for the future of each of their countries. And that's really what the UN is trying to say, and that's what we're trying to say with regard to education. Now the question is, what actions can we take that will have the desired impact and have this flexibility of bottom-up participation and mutual reinforcement? Back to Mei-Lin.
So we must build back better. In our lifetimes, there will never be a better opportunity to actually make this shift to lifelong learning and lifelong earning, where people can connect to thrive. We ask you to join us, not because we have the plan, because we want you to be part of working with us, to do the plan, to make the plan, to implement it. We have begun to bring together the players. We want you to be a player. And email me. I will work with you to make sure that this happens. I have seen miracles happen. I grew through Singapore. I worked in Intel and saw how systematic forecasting and coordination really helped to make Intel what it was and spread through the valley. These things can happen. I've been part of it. So let's do it. Join Vint and I, and email me to let me know what you might be interested in doing with us.
So there's more here. First of all, why don't you unshare your screen? Oh, yeah. Well, here we go. I'm sorry if you had more to show.
No. I just was.
The reason I want you to unshare your screen is for you to see the rest of us and also see the comments in the chat, because there are people who are making some very, very interesting suggestions and observations. I think that we should let them give voice to some of this. And Jane Coffin has made a number of comments. So Jane, if you'd like to unmute, would you like to share your thinking as a result of this discussion so far?
Absolutely, Vint. And thank you very much to you and Mei-Lin. We're very keen, and as you know, we're community focused, bottom up. Strong believers in that some of the smaller and medium-sized networks that you all know have built the internet, as well as the big nets, can help us look at an internet way of networking or working, which is also suggesting other types of alternative funding models. And so we'll carry that message to the Broadband Commission, the UN Broadband Commission next week. We're not saying that the larger, very important infrastructure projects and the funding isn't important. I've worked on aid projects in the past. But I have seen things happen, as Mei-Lin and you know, with small community networks and internet exchange points go from 3 or 4 people with a vision and some magic happening in the back end with our donations and our help and our great teams around the world. But it really is this building the broad base of the pyramid of expertise and sustainability at the local level. And so we're strong believers in some of this community-based architecture being built and the technical community being built. So we're here to help. We're more focused on that infrastructure and the training. So we'd be here to help you with NREN side of the house as well, because we work with quite a few of them to build the internet exchange points or community networks. And as I sometimes tweet, the human nets build the net nets. So it's about people.
That's right. Let's see. There are several people have asked to speak. I see Carolina also, but hang on one. Rajinder has had several very interesting comments, and so I don't know if you'd like to elaborate on those for the rest of us. But Rajinder, would you like to take a moment? Don't forget. Maybe not. Okay. Carolina, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Vint, and hi, everybody. I just wanted to bring some examples from Brazil, where I'm from originally, because some more than examples, they are challenges I see being faced by various communities. Brazil has been working a lot in some community-based networks, and with the Lumen Foundation, who is behind a Khan Academy, as you all guys know. Sorry for the dog in the background. They are now trying to put together organization, and now that I understand the focus of this group, I'm gonna definitely connect you to them. And it's a very, very big investment they wanna do, because even when we see CGI data saying 70% of Brazilian schools are connected, if you actually go to the schools or to the communities around the schools, they are not. Or the speed is so low that really doesn't help. And with COVID, as you all know, you literally see people taking the computers and laptops closer to the school to see if they get that Wi-Fi, because that's the only Wi-Fi connection in the region. So my curiosity on the call of action is like, what are all the layers we're gonna look into as a group to ensure that it doesn't become a statistic, you know? It actually, we have accountability later.
So, Carolina, this is Vint. Absolutely agree. First, I want to emphasize the fact that in each instance, we have to look at the local conditions and ask what's missing. And then we have to ask what are the barriers to overcome, and they will vary. It could be economics, it could be government policy, it could be availability of investment money, it could be technology and people skilled to take an to act, to do implementation. So she's spot on with regard to looking at the local conditions. The other thing which is really important is that content really counts here in terms of its effect on education. And so having good quality content is important. The pandemic has highlighted fractures in our economic and social systems everywhere in the world. And those fractures are painful and difficult to deal with. Some of them have enormous economic side effects, but we need to learn from them. This is almost like we've had a special kind of microscope with a certain kind of light exposing those fractures. The pandemic is like ultraviolet or infrared or X-ray. It's telling us what's missing in our societies, and we should learn from that. Again, paying attention to local conditions really counts. Finally, I would say that we really have to work hard to allow parallel efforts that may not even be coordinating with each other to end up having a mutually constructive consequence. And the degree to which we can achieve that objective will allow us to have a multiplicity of activities all around the world having a common effect, which is improving access to education for literally billions of students around the world. So who else has hands up? Just wave at me or jump in.
I think Minerva Minerva is from the UNDP is making a really good comment. Minerva, would you be able to speak? Maybe not.
Yes, as soon as I can turn on as soon as I can turn on my video and my microphone. Pleasure to be here, colleagues. Thank you for the invitation, and fantastic to finally speak directly with people that I've just read about, been reading about for years. You know who you are. And I posted a comment, suggestion, in fact, in the chat, and really proposing, this is fantastic and impressive, first of all, thank you so much, and suggesting, in fact, to be very intentional about capacity building and what we mean by it. What capacity, whose capacities, in how are we going to do it? And from the development community, we see the demands coming from the ground. As you know, UNDP works in about 175 countries. And we are every day requested for support and building on the needs that we saw from months when the pandemic hit, when we see even governments not able to function because of the lack for the necessary digital capacities, that we had to lend them our own systems to be able to function. So that's one capacity where they need a lot of support on. There are various other areas that they need support on. And this group has the intellectual capital that could be really transformative for a lot of governments that we work with and the communities. So what capacities, with capacities, how really need to be clear. Also, Jane and I were just exchanging notes in the chat on the need to develop the digital ecosystems, very much like the internet. So if we don't go in and build the local ecosystems, the national, the regional, and so on, all this will fall apart. And more than any group, this group understands the essence of that. And there was other point that I wanted to make is that if there was a call for working more closely with the development community in advancing the SDGs, and for digital capacity to really move the needle, or all needles across all SDGs, then we need to have this closer collaboration in linking the efforts in the very priorities that the governments have identified, really rooted to local and national contexts, and really rooted in the priorities as defined by the countries and the communities themselves. And that's really the focus of UNDP, in helping identify those priorities, in helping develop the SDG roadmaps, and then pulling what we can together to help countries and communities advance those. So the pandemic has underscored, obviously, if it was not clear before to many, it is absolutely clear now that we need to build the digital capacities of countries, especially those lagging behind, and the communities within those countries. So one of the things that we can propose is to work closely together in assessing, first of all, the capacities as they are now and where the gaps are. We tend to see a lot of efforts that are introduced to address a need here and there. So there's a cacophony of efforts pushing for innovation here and there. And then the danger, obviously, about what ecosystem exactly are we trying to build that can propel the lasting progress that we all aim for. So inspecting, obviously, and analyzing exactly the digital landscape of a country, and then to be able to work closely with governments and all partners in trying to develop a roadmap that is really specific to their context. That's a very, very difficult endeavor, because contexts differ everywhere you go, and there can't be a one-size-fits-all. And that's where the danger we see now, in fact, in this field, when we speak about digital capacity building, there needs to be an understanding of exactly what we're trying to achieve. And what we're trying to propose here is that let's link that to the development priorities of the countries. and the communities together and start with, and this is a very, very good start. It's fantastic to hear all of you and see all of you. And we look forward to more engagement moving forward. Thank you.
So let me jump in and ask you to do, all of you, if you're interested. If you move your cursor around, you'll see at the bottom of the screen on the right, 3 little dots. Those are sometimes called a hamburger. If you click on that, you'll see a menu of items that you can go to. And if you go to the change layout version and you select tiled, then you can move a slider down at the bottom of the tiled screen to get as many as 49 people up on the screen at the same time. So you might want to do that so you can see more than the normal, say, 16 or so. The second thing is that if you look at the bottom of the screen again, as you're moving your cursor, the little pop-up, there's something that says turn on captions, and you might find it interesting to see the quality of the caption system as well. So if you click on turn on captions, you'll see that as well. Rajinder was able to unmute, so I'd like to call on him. Keep in mind, we only have about 8 or 9 minutes left, so let's try to be brief enough to allow other people to make comments. After Rajinder, I'd like to call on Isfandiar. So Rajinder, the floor is yours for a couple of minutes.
Well, thanks, Vince. I think as we are heading into this information and tech revolution and tech world, we really have to, use some of those skills from the internet, some of those learnings, and apply them. Decentralization is one of them, but hyper-centralization also, in the sense of like YouTube providing, allowing people to be content producers and content creators. Same thing like Airbnb that shifts the models of how, local businesses can operate, and like Facebook, who is basically connecting, 2 billion people around the world. So on that sense, we have to look at decentralization and also hyper-centralization as a means for delivering new knowledge tools. But I want to take a step back, and I believe that we need like a futures council on learning and education, where we can, then set the framework and set the pace for different actors and stakeholders to come together to work on both sides of the equation, meaning the demand side, where the ministries, the policies are happening, the ICT infrastructure is happening, the future of labor and future of work is being defined, and on the supply side, which is basically the student learning process, the forming and informing process, those pedagogic processes to build those new skills that we need into the future. And on the third point, I think that the internet can also help, to radically accelerate, network buildups. So when we talk about network buildups, I think we should look at data networks, information networks, knowledge networks, wisdom networks, narrative networks, and even evaluation and monitoring networks. So I think a lot of this infrastructure, software infrastructure, can be built collectively, can be built under the umbrella of the Future Council or on learning and education or something like that. So on that note, I'm giving it back to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Isfandiar, you have the floor. If you can, if you've unmuted, so good.
Yeah, thank you, Vint. Hi everyone. My efforts, very simple. It's related to financing lots of optical fiber, taking it to rural areas, and making sure that it's actually affordable. One of the big insights we've had is we want to move telecom infrastructure away from value-based pricing and towards cost-based pricing. As many of you know, marginal cost of handling more users on a high bandwidth network like fiber is virtually zero. So if we did live in a cost-based pricing world, the internet prices should be declining year on year. And we're seeing some examples of this already. The Palapa Ring in Indonesia is a really great example of a very ambitious project that was financed using an availability payment scheme. And what that basically means is that fiber was for the first time financed as if it were a toll road. The question, Vint, I want to ask you is that I loved the graph you showed on IETF, and it just made me think that perhaps it's time to have like an internet financial engineering task force. Because I mean, even our world, the financing world, kind of runs on code. There are deals that are feasible, there are deals that are not feasible. And bankers and financiers can tell you, okay, I can write a check on this, I can't write a check on this. So I'm wondering, what guidance would you give to say, hey, okay, if you want to get financiers together to say, we want to change the incentive structure, we want to flood the world with fiber, we want to ensure it delivers cost-based pricing. What would you say to people like me, other than the work that I'm doing, to get started?
Well, given that there isn't a lot of time and there's a long story to tell, the short story here is that IETF allows anyone who wants to join the organization. There are no criteria, just show up. So you have to be prepared for that. The second thing is that people get to submit proposals in the form of internet drafts without getting permission from anyone.
Okay.
Third, when you do want a working group, when you want people to help you make something happen, then you have to justify that by having what's called a birds of a feather session to verify that the participants in the Internet Engineering Task Force are in agreement that they want to work on that. But it's very flexible because anybody can propose a working group and anyone can decide whether they want to participate in it. So there is at the top level of all this some management of the documentation, there's management of the meetings and things like that. But the underlying driver here is voluntary participation in virtually everything. Okay, and now let's, we have a moment, I think, for at least one more comment. Mei-Lin, is there someone you thought?
Yes. Kiran Sethi of Design for Change, who has been working with children in 60 countries. Kiran, can you speak?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I'll just quickly jump in and share with you a little bit of the focus of what we've been doing. While I totally agree that it needs a systems approach, and I think, like Vince said, the pandemic just kind of unmasked an already broken system. But I think the main focus, at least from Design for Change, is to focus on the humane aspects of who we are. So much of it is around infrastructure and digitization. But for us to be able to take, I keep saying we are human by chance, but we become humane by choice. And the decisions we make and the choices we make in terms of what we give our children will probably be an area that technology can just support to amplify. So Design for Change has actually created a very simple framework that truly is fit for context. It is universal, it is extremely versatile, and since it is now working in over 70 countries, we find that it gives children a framed freedom and the ability to actually action that we would love to see how that can support all the work you're doing. So we're super excited to be part of this. So thank you so much. And Vint, you're a rock star. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kiran. We're basically out of time. Note the parallelism in Kiran's comment, extremely important to allow parallel things to go together. Mei-Lin, I think we need to wrap this one up.
Terrific. We are creating a global help desk where it's a help desk for everyone, but it's us together being the global help team. So thank you, Vint. Thank you, everyone.
Those of you, if for some reason you're not on the PCI, People-Centered Internet mailing list, you should get on it. And second, on that list, we can tell people more about how they can participate. Great. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. I hope all of your efforts bear fruit. Bye-bye for now.
And the world will be a better place. And the world will be a better place for you and me. Just work and see. Put a little joy in your heart. Come on, everybody. Put a little joy in your heart. Put a little joy in your heart.